Hello everybody, this is Shane with Shane's Books and Review, and I hope that you are having a wonderful day today. Today we are going to be talking about the return of Sherlock Holmes, which was wrote by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and at least in the United States it was released in 1905, could have been different in other countries, and we're going to be talking about two stories today. The first story today will be The Adventure of the Golden Pince-Nez, and the second story today will be The Adventure of the Missing Three-Quarter. Today's first book is The Adventure of the Golden Pince-Nez. It's like a monocle, glasses. And our adventure opens up with Watson and Sherlock. One horrible November evening. Yes, it was a little dramatic on that, but anyway. Stanley Hopkins comes by to visit with them, and he starts explaining about a violent death that had occurred. The person that was murdered was Willoughby Smith. He was like a professional assistant or secretary, however you want to look at that. I would think more of a lab aide. But he was aiding a older gentleman that was almost an invalid, couldn't do a lot of things on his own, which was Professor Quorum. And the murder had took place at Professor Quorum's house. Poor old Willoughby had met his end due to a wax knife. And Hopkins is having a very, very hard time trying to justify why Willoughby was murdered. It seems to make really no sense. Willoughby doesn't seem to have any enemies. He doesn't have a troubled past. And there doesn't seem to be any reason why something like this would happen to him. Willoughby's dying words were, "Professor, it was she." And in this book, I was quite impressed by Hopkins and his methods. I believe that he mentioned that he was trying to put forth the same methodology that Sherlock would be using in this, but he had such a trouble. So first he talked to the maid, and the maid told Stanley Hopkins, the inspector, that she had heard Willoughby coming out of his room and down the stairs because she recognized his brisk step. But shortly after that, there was a hoarse, loud scream that came. She rushed in to find him on the floor. And that was when Willoughby issued his final words of, "Professor, it was she." Stanley starts walking Sherlock through the different things that he tried to figure out. Like, there's a couple paths, but on the paths, there's no way to tell if there was footprints or not. And also that with as bad as it was raining, that they were having a hard time figuring out which way they were coming or going, but they did find a set of prints. But unfortunately, because of as much rain as they had received at that time, they couldn't even tell if the footprints were supposed to be for big feet or for small feet. Stanley continues to tell Sherlock and Watson about this plight. Inspector Stanley continues to tell Sherlock and Watson about what he had investigated, being that there didn't seem to be anything missing. Nothing was forced open. The professor indeed still had his key to everything that was important, and the only real piece of evidence that was found was in the clutched hand of Willoughby, which was a pair of golden-rimmed glasses. And here comes Sherlock. "Hey, do you mind if I see those? Let me take a look at those little Pince-Nez glasses that you got there. Those gold-rimmed glasses? Ooh, let me see those." And he gets a hold of them and starts examining them and puts them on his face, pulls them down, pushes them up, looks down the street, looks at this, blah, 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 blah. It was highly detailed to be so short. It was kind of fun. And after his completely incredible inspection of these glasses, he comes up with all kinds of things about them. The first thing that he comes to is this must be a woman that wears these. She must be a somewhat good breeding, that she does dress quite like a lady, because if she wasn't a fashion, why would she have these sorts of things? She must have an incredibly thick nose because it didn't fit on him at all. And somehow he gets to the idea that she has a forward-facing face, much like, I'm guessing, a predator, and that her shoulders would be rounded, all from the glasses. And there was one last catch. She had been to the optometrist twice. The book does get into the explanations for it, and some of it I would call it exposition at best, but that's my opinion. What do you know where the box is down there. If you have other ideas, I'd love to hear it. On our next scene, Of course, Stanley, Sherlock, and Watson all take off to go visit with the professor at his estate. Upon beginning his investigation, Sherlock Holmes finds not a whole lot. Everywhere where there seems that there could be evidence, there's reasons why there's none. Like they have coconut matting in different places. With the rain and this, that, and the other, there's really no footprints. And then he notes that with those glasses, as strong as they are, that somebody not having those would have an incredibly hard way to go to avoid the path. He found it very, very strange, especially because there was none leaving. There was only one set, so it was assumed that it was just the set coming to the house. On the bureau, he finds where the lock is a couple of scratches. And he questions the maid about this. Hey, what is all this? Why is this here? What's going on? He's like, you cleaned this, right? Yes, that's the maid. And she didn't notice that those scratches were there the last time that she had cleaned it, which was actually fairly recently. Sherlock continues to go about his investigation, looking at different things and even smoking the gentleman's cigarettes quite fervently. So during the time period where Sherlock is smoking these cigarettes fervently, he is investigating the professor, and he goes over to where the bureau is and starts dropping ashes everywhere, but doesn't bother cleaning them up. Once he gets done interviewing the professor, Watson's like, what's going on with this? Do you have any clues? Because I can't really see where this is coming from. And Sherlock tells him, hey, if we've got one chance at this, it's those ashes. So come on, let's go. And of course, by this time, Sherlock has already started to figure out that something's amiss. Something's just not quite where it should be. There's something that's just not right about this situation. So he's setting traps. The next thing he does is he goes out and talks to the housekeeper, which seems like a fairly unrelated conversation because he's talking about the professor's eating habits. And we find out during that time period that the professor's usually a fairly light eater. With everything that's happened, she just would have such a hard time eating, but it seems like it's only increased the professor's appetites. Starts to fall more in line with what Sherlock was thinking was going on. Later on that afternoon, Sherlock, Watson, and Inspector Stanley return to the professor's room, and Sherlock does one of his clumsy, I've knocked it over moments, and knocks over the professor's cigarettes all over the floor. But he uses that opportunity to inspect his ashes to see if they got ground in while he was out of the room, which confirms that there is a hidey hole. And at that point, the murder springs from a hidden place inside the bureau, and we start to find out what actually happened. This woman had come in secret and had employed the previous secretary for the professor, which didn't stay very long, but did stay long enough to get a mold for a key so that this woman could obtain some documents that she wanted. When Willoughby walked into the room, she was quite surprised by him, so she grabs the nearest thing that she can find, which happens to be a sealing wax knife, and attacked him. And they escape. She loses her glasses, and that explains how Willoughby had those glasses in his hand, and the reason why he said professor, it was she. Because earlier that day, he had ran into a woman, and he had shared his experience with the professor. Now is where it gets a little more interesting, though, because we find out that estranged person, that odd woman that was hiding inside of a cabinet, a bureau, inside of his bedroom, was none other than his old wife, Anna. And Anna starts to, quite frankly, spill the beans about everything. She's acting like she's hurting while she's doing it. She's making her way over to the professor's bed. And we find out through her bean spilling that both her and the professor were indeed Russian. And previously, before the professor's escape to England, both she and the professor were nihilists before the professor's escape to England. And she and a non-violent nihilist and the professor and everybody got wrapped into this big scheme, and her husband or somebody in their group ends up killing a police officer, and they all get thrown into a really bad prison, a gulag. Now, the professor ran away, but he kept a hold of a diary that would actually clear his wife Anna and her nonviolent friend that she had absolutely fallen in love with during the time that they worked next to each other in this prison camp. So her hopes was to get this letter to free him, to absolve herself and not so much her husband for her husband's sin in her eyes. Now, while she was in the bureau, she had some sort of poison that she took, and that was the reason why she was slowly wilting as she was telling this story. So she makes him promise on his honor of the love of the right thing to take these documents to the Russian embassy in order to have her friend exonerated and freed from such a horrible life. And of course, Sherlock does. And now it's time for another one. Yes! It is The Adventure of the Missing Three-Quarter. And this one seemed to have a bit of a different formulation than others that I had read. I don't suspect that somebody else wrote it by far. That's not what I'm saying here. What I am saying is Sherlock stories usually have a little bit of misdirection, and there's usually a lot of information that's given to help you figure out for that story what's going on, which is part of the game to me. It's part of the fun of it all. But with that being said, this one, it wasn't such a huge murderous, blah, 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 blah story. No. And it was indeed not that story, which I have mentioned in another video, but it was enjoyable. And Mr. Cyril Overton comes and visits with Sherlock, which is kind of cool in a way, because Sherlock has established himself, and Watson has as well. There seems to be less man crush going on now, which is kind of cool. But I digress. So, Mr. Overton comes from Trinity College looking for Sherlock and Watson because one of his stars has come up missing. His star being Godfrey Staunton. And Staunton apparently is the key to Mr. Overton's upcoming rugby matches. And Godfrey is, of course, a three-quarter, which is a position in rugby. Mr. Overton goes on about some of the other players that are on the team, but even though this guy can play that position, he was trained as this position instead, and he's probably going to run up on the line instead of staying where he's supposed to be. It's going to be horrible. I can't do this. My God, Mr. Sherlock, you've got to help me find this guy, or England will be ruined forever. I mean, that's kind of the way that I see him reacting to all this. I can also see Sherlock just sitting still smoking a pipe, and I can also see Watson with a book on his lap looking through his eyebrow at this guy going, wow, really? Dude, you might want to calm down a little bit. So the biggest crux for Mr. Overton is that tomorrow they're going to have a major game against Oxford, and there's no way they're going to win without Godfrey. And there was this little bit of back and forth in between Mr. Overton and Sherlock whenever he starts... There was a little bit of a back and forth in between Sherlock and Mr. Overton when Mr. Overton starts doing a bunch of name dropping, and Sherlock meticulously goes to where he keeps his information on past villains or people that are interesting and need to be known about and what their specialties are, like check fraud or whatever, and doesn't find these names, but the last name did sound familiar to him. Mr. Overton gives Sherlock the 012 of, oh, I thought that you knew most everything. And Sherlock responds to him in a way that's like, look, that's like, I can't know everything. And your life is much more beautiful than my own, and a little bit more clean than my own. I can't know everything, but to give Sherlock a little bit of credit here, he does show the same amount of care to Mr. Overton into this situation as he would pretty much anything else, which is fairly right on. Now we get to travel to the hotel where they were staying, they being the rugby team, and Sherlock starts asking some questions. He talks to a porter, he talks to several people, and he starts putting together this story of what had happened before Godfrey had disappeared. Godfrey apparently had been kind of pale and just kind of a little odd acting earlier in the day, and as the day progresses, his behavior got just a little bit more erratic and perhaps even neurotic. And in fact, there's a disgruntled big man with a beard that comes in and demands to talk to Godfrey, and then just as soon as words are exchanged, without getting anything, Godfrey and this bearded guy takes off running, and that's the last that Godfrey was seen. Now, Mr. Overton, during the meantime, sends wires out to find out if Godfrey can be found. Mr. Overton reaches out to Cambridge and to one of Godfrey's relatives, which is a very rich relative, which was Lord Mount James Staunton. And oh, for characters I don't like, he's certainly one of them. And this is where things finally starts to wrap up at the hotel. When Sherlock finally finishes speaking with Overton, he goes back down and talks to the porter and finds that that bearded guy that Godfrey disappeared with wasn't a gentleman and wasn't like a dirty, grimy worker either. And he asked the porter more about this, and he says, well, there was a telegram that was sent earlier in the day, and whenever I asked Godfrey if he wanted me to send it, he said that he would do it himself. So Sherlock goes back up to Godfrey's room again and looks at the blotter and where you would write, the writing station, and finally finds a clue. And the really only true things that can be made out in that is stand by us for God's sake. So who is the us? Is it the bearded gentleman and Godfrey, or what? One last question about the bearded guy had the revelation that there was only one thing the porter heard, and that was time. The behavior of the bearded guy, he was shaky, he was upset, there was some kind of major problem happening. And this is where things start to tie together for Sherlock. He starts to think, well, it must be that it's a blackmail type of a thing, it must be that he's tied into some kind of bad actors, bad behavior with other people, and now he's going to be blackmailed. The thoughts are kind of back and forth, but it all has to do with that. Instead of taking off and visiting with Lord Mount James actually comes and visits with Sherlock and Watson over the matter and seems completely oblivious to the idea that his younger relative Godfrey could be kidnapped to extort his wealth, because he's a very pragmatic individual. He will not spend money on things that doesn't need to have money spent on them. And he has a really just bad attitude really in general about this whole situation. Even saying things to the effect that, no, Godfrey won't get a dime out of me. Nothing's going to happen. No. But then there's this thing about this doctor. And Sherlock starts talking to the doctor and tells the doctor that seems to know Godfrey on an intimate level that Godfrey's missing, and there's no reaction. Here we go. Now we're finally starting to get somewhere. It was his failure of reacting which clued in Sherlock on this might be where we need to be looking to get to the bottom of this. It needs to be said that during the conversation with Sherlock and with the doctor, that he does inquire about the health of Godfrey, and the doctor informs Sherlock that no, Godfrey is quite healthy. And Sherlock's, this bill for 13 guinea. What's it for then? I got you. And he pretty well gets ran out of his office. It is at that point where Sherlock starts following the doctor on a bike, and eventually the doctor pulls a quick one on Sherlock and goes, hey, this is a very long stretch of road, and it would be such a shame if you try to get past my very slow buggy and you got hurt. It was well played, really. It gave me a good chuckle, especially with the exacerbation that was sure to be on Sherlock's face as he's telling Watson about all this. And just on cue, as Sherlock expected, the carriage comes pulling back in just shortly after Sherlock got back. So he knows that the doctor's up to something no good too. So we've got two no goods. We've got, what is this Godfrey kid tied into that is bad, and why is the doctor also tied into something that he doesn't want to share, especially if he's such an intimate friend. Since Sherlock has pretty well burned a bridge there, he starts going around to the townspeople, but doesn't get a whole lot because everybody's already like, nah, we know your game, sir, and we're just not going to talk. But he does get some information out of one guy, and he tells him, look, the doctor over there, he's really not a doctor per se. He does a lot of the mind doctor stuff. But he does take a carriage ride almost every evening now, which is strange because he used to not do that. So now we got more ideas of what's going on. So Sherlock tells Watson that he's devised a plan and that they need to get to bed early because in the morning they're going to track him down. So when Watson wakes up that next morning and it's early, he notices that the carriage that's going to be taking the doctor out is already ready and the doctor's getting ready to go. He finds his friend with a hypodermic needle and immediately thinks, oh no, he's falling back to his bad habits. But when questioned about that needle, Sherlock tells Watson, no, this is going to be what helps us solve the case. They sneak over and put the aniseed oil on the tire, and a hound shows up that Sherlock had sequestered, and they follow where the carriage goes later on to find Godfrey inside of a cottage. And Godfrey is with a lady, and she seems not to be doing well and or has died. And this is where we start to find out some of the underlying things. Again, with the nobility class, where there was a lot of social pressure on this poor Godfrey kid not to be who he wanted to be, not to be himself. And he and other people knew quite well that if he didn't marry within his own class structure, that his uncle wouldn't approve and his inheritance more than likely wouldn't come to him. The problem being was Godfrey had fallen in love with a young lady and was married. So this was a secret that they were keeping from the world and hopefully from Godfrey's uncle. Hence the reason why the doctor was so nonplussé about it, because he already knew what was really going on. And yes, indeed, Godfrey wasn't missing, because I just saw him. I know where he's at. While they are with Godfrey, who seems to be just completely shell-shocked and who really wouldn't be, the doctor comes back. He had his driver double back and starts to give Sherlock the once over, and Sherlock's like, whoa, 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 whoa. I don't work for this Lord Mountjoy that you have such a disdain for, and I don't understand why you have it in the first place. But yeah, I don't work for that guy. In fact, I was just here because of the rugby match. They were looking for their three-quarter player. And he goes on to tell him, look, I've already told you, if you take me into your confidence completely, I can make these sorts of things that need to stay discreet, be discreet, but if you don't and other people get a hold of it, then, you know, it's going to be a bad thing. What gives? And the doctor's like, oh, wow, did I misjudge you? I'm so sorry. Well, since you already know all this stuff, I can answer these questions for you fairly easily. So then he explains that the woman that is now dead with Godfrey was actually his wife, and tells him about the pressures from his uncle, etc. And we find out the entire rest of the story. The reason why Godfrey's wife had died was she had consumption. I wonder if some of you might know what consumption is, and some of you might not. Tuberculosis, or TB, which indeed makes that a very sad, sad scene indeed. Congratulations, you have done it. That's right, we've made it to the end of the video, and I want to thank you so much for watching today, especially if you stuck it through to the end. If you happen to be new here, we would love to have you join our family. Look for the subscribe button. Should be floating at the end of the video here, or if you don't want to wait for that, down there. Also, if you saw something in here that you liked and enjoyed and think that maybe somebody else would, why don't you throw it a like and share it. If you happen to find a good book in between now and the next video, make sure you tell me about it in the description box down there. We'll check it out, we'll read it together, and we'll have a discussion. Again, today's book has been The Return of Sherlock Holmes. This has been Shane with Shane's Books in Review, and I'll see you in the next video.